Hi, I'm Nat. Today I'm here to talk to you about the challenges and opportunities of disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction. I created this presentation during my studies towards a master's degree in emergency management at Massey University in New Zealand. This video is a problem statement. I'll be talking more in terms of issues as opposed to answers. Later this year, I'll be working on a best practice guide to meet the challenges that I raise in this presentation. We'll begin with two case studies, then look into global statistics and conceptual models for understanding disability. Next, I'll show how disability shows up in disasters and in the context of disaster risk reduction, or DRR. We'll look at some of the work being done on the topic and what I see as some of the most pressing challenges of disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction, and also some significant positive opportunities. For our first case study, at 6:20 a.m. on the 8th of November 2018, a wildfire started near Camp Creek Road in Butte County, California. Fed by hot, dry winds in an area that recently experienced record vegetation growth, this fire came to be known as the Camp Fire and was one of the most catastrophic fires in California history. There's a really good documentary on Netflix which I recommend. This fire fully consumed 85% of all structures in the towns of Paradise, Magalia, and Concow, including 13,972 homes, plus schools, hospitals, and aged care facilities. More than 50,000 people were evacuated in chaotic, fast-changing conditions. Some cars had to be abandoned in traffic jams, though mostly people were able to safely evacuate by foot, or they sheltered in temporary defensive refuge areas. This was a community with known hazard exposure and well-developed plans and alerting systems that largely kept people safe, despite emergency services being overwhelmed. Operations centers and command points repeatedly had to shift location as their positions were overrun by the fire front. 50,000 people were safely evacuated and survived the fire, but sadly, 85 people died. Charges of criminal negligence were brought against Pacific Gas and Electric for poor maintenance practices, which created the conditions that led to the fire. Of 83 identifiable casualties, the average age was 72 years old. Many of the casualties had complex disabilities, including amputees, wheelchair users, or folks with neurological disability. The youngest victim, age 20, was sheltering in place along with her mother and grandmother. Two people in their 30s and 40s died while trying to assist other older people. The overwhelming theme from the victim impact report was that those who died were old and disabled, or caregivers and family members who died trying to assist old and disabled people. Lessons we can learn from this event include disabled people are at greater risk in disaster situations due to increased vulnerability and exposure to hazards. Also, disabled people can be a hard to reach or hidden subpopulation, not fully accounted for in emergency planning. And finally, although your community may have a well-developed emergency plan in place, disabled people and their caregivers may lack the resources or functional capability to enact that plan. For our next case study, we'll consider an example of emergency housing. About 300,000 homes were destroyed during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Emergency housing was provided by the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, by installing mobile homes in the front yard of damaged houses or in new temporary communities. These became known as FEMA trailers. The FEMA trailer program addressed an urgent need for accommodation during an extended recovery period after a major disaster. However, some people lived in these trailers for over 7 years, despite the program's negative effects on public health while increasing existing racial disparities. The trailers were overcrowded, and they gave off toxic fumes from their cheap construction materials. Also, the trailers remained the property of the U.S. government, and the government was the kind of landlord who wouldn't allow occupants to make any alterations. This became especially a problem for disabled people, as the trailers had interior layouts and built-in features that were inaccessible for some disabled people. When trailers were finally returned to the U.S. government, they had to be resold with stickers notifying they were not fit to be used for housing, because by then the toxic fumes issue was too well documented to ignore. After Hurricane Katrina, a huge number of people needed immediate disaster relief in unprecedented circumstances. The FEMA trailer program met this need at scale. However, increased community engagement with vulnerable populations would have improved outcomes. Lessons we can learn from this event are that it's important to consult with disabled people and vulnerable populations both prior to a disaster and throughout the recovery phase. Otherwise, Well-meaning interventions might exacerbate existing social problems or create new ones. This consequence is in opposition to the Sendai framework principle of Build Back Better. So let's have a look at the numbers around disability. The New Zealand 2023 Household Disability Survey was based on a standard set of questions about functional needs, which was developed by the Washington Group on Disability Statistics. Use of the Washington questions allows the findings to be compared with other international studies of disability. This survey found that 17% of New Zealanders, that's 900,000 people or 1 in 6, are disabled. The numbers are a bit worse if you're Maori or Pacifica. Just over 1 in 5 Maori people are disabled. Disability prevalence is also a bit higher for women than men, and 29% of people who identify as LGBTQ+ also have disability. This is in line with international findings, which show disability increases among more vulnerable populations and also increases with age. Note that 10% of children aged 0 to 14 are disabled, compared with 35% of older people over 65. Furthermore, the 2023 survey found that disabled people have worse health outcomes, they experience greater economic hardship, live in lower quality housing, and are more likely to be unemployed. Like me, you might be surprised to learn that unpaid carers, mostly family carers, outnumber paid nurses by almost 8 to 1. Also, remember that 10% of kids are disabled. The carers of disabled children are more stressed, have less free time, and are less likely to have a paid job than carers of non-disabled children. These trends match with international findings. Interestingly, there's no global consensus on how to define severe disability requiring higher levels of care. The World Health Organization World Health Survey estimates 2.2% of the world population has very significant functional impairment, while the Global Burden of Disease study by IHME estimates 3.8% of the world population has severe disability as inferred through clinical diagnosis. The key fact here is somewhere between 2 to 4% of people require significant help from caregivers for help with daily life. Okay, so how can we understand disability? It's a complex topic. Every individual's accessibility needs are unique, so it's hard to generalize, but let's give it a go. We might categorize disability by type, such as issues with vision, hearing, or mobility, including both physical coordination and movement. Cognitive issues, including intellectual disability or learning disability or cognitive difference, and other issues such as chronic pain or genetic differences which might be invisible. Some people assert that neurological differences such as autism and dyslexia are not true disabilities, but part of the normal human genetic variation. Similarly, some people might argue high body weight is a disability, while others would disagree. Look, this is only a very crude categorization. You can find a more comprehensive discussion elsewhere, such as in the Sage Handbook of Disability Studies. Okay, so just considering vision, we might classify visual disability in terms of severity. For example, a person might be totally blind, or might have moderate vision loss, or else a person might be colorblind. On the other hand, let's remember that visual disability could be permanent or temporary. An otherwise sighted person might become temporarily blind after surgery, and everyone is situationally blind if you're put in a darkened room. This tells us that visual disability is contextual. The same ideas hold true for every category of disability, whether it's sensory, physical, cognitive, or whatever. If we put all these ideas together, the social model of disability frames disability as a condition we might all find ourselves in depending on context. Two key takeaways from this idea are, if we consider the people who live in that top corner box who are severely and permanently disabled, if we come up with an adaptive solution that works for people with high level of disability there, then it works for everyone. Secondly, and this is important, the folks who live their whole life up in that top corner, people with severe and permanent disability, have valuable lived experience and perspectives that can help everyone. Now I want to show how disability thinking has evolved over time. Historically, disability and impairment were seen as traits belonging to the individual. Ableism is the term for discrimination against disabled people, which was widespread through most of history. Public sentiment began to shift as disabled soldiers returned from various big wars overseas in the last century, resulting in government programs and institutions to help disabled people. Under the social model of disability formulated during the civil rights movements in the 1900s, disability is not a trait inherent to the individual, but instead arises through a mismatch with society, resulting in a person's basic needs not being met. Disability disappears when appropriate accommodations are made. Now, a trap you might get into with the social model is if people say, yes, okay, so society disables people by not meeting their needs, but we've only got so much budget for that, and maybe this isn't high on our priorities. That's the voice of ableism. But in 2006, the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities brought about a new era in which accessibility is framed as a basic human right. Like all other human rights, governments have the moral duty to ensure people's human rights are being met. Disability activists will tell you that although accessible solutions might be more expensive and take more time, they tend to improve conditions for everybody of all abilities. Therefore, accessibility accommodations should be seen as a responsible and wise investment rather than an optional cost. Also, after any large enough disaster, nobody's needs are going to be met by society anymore. The social model tells us this is disability. So in a post-disaster context, accessibility is an everybody issue, not just something that applies to some people. Okay, so let's look at the global context. The Convention on the Persons of Rights with Disabilities was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2006. New Zealand is a signatory. This is one of 9 core international human rights instruments alongside the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this is international law. It's legally binding for signatories to remove accessibility barriers, and also Article 11 of the Convention clarifies obligations during humanitarian emergencies. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is a core framework for international cooperation alongside the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change. The Sendai Framework is voluntary for signatories, including New Zealand, and calls for not only disability engagement, but disability leadership to achieve universally accessible response, recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Finally, the Humanitarian Inclusion Standards for Older People and People with Disabilities is one of 9 handbooks in the Humanitarian Standards Partnership alongside the Sphere Handbook. This is a statement of best practice based on evidence and wide global consultation. Okay, so what does this look like in New Zealand? It is technically illegal to discriminate against disabled people under New Zealand law. However, the burden is on the affected person to bring their complaint to the Human Rights Commissioner and prove that they've been discriminated against. Certain standards have been adopted by the public service, such as digital accessibility standards, but outside of government, this is voluntary. New Zealand's National Disaster Resilience Strategy and National Adaptation Plan both align well with the Sendai framework by taking a whole-of-society approach to understand and manage risk, including societal exposure and vulnerability, in addition to considering hazards. The Disaster Resilience Strategy is explicitly linked to the New Zealand Disability Strategy and the New Zealand Carers Strategy. However, national strategies and plans are at risk of potential policy changes. As one example of recently proposed legislation, the Disability Support Services Bill 2026 was developed with zero community consultation and shifts the primary duty of care from the state to family members, which may be contrary to obligations under the Disability Convention. That's the voice of ableism again, asking what's our budget for that? Although encouragingly, it was announced last week that this bill will be amended to meet New Zealand's obligations under the UN Convention for Disability Rights. Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction, or DIDRR, is a relatively new field of practice which addresses the vulnerabilities of disabled people who are disproportionately exposed, underprepared, and unprotected during disasters. Professor Villeneuve is lead researcher for a disability inclusive initiative that's been operating across Australia and around the world for the last decade. In this initiative, PCEP, or Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness, is about capability-focused self-assessment followed by individual planning and actions based on your own abilities, difficulties, and resources. Whereas disability-inclusive emergency planning is about multi-stakeholder, community-led planning to give extra support to disabled people in emergencies. Recently, the Wellington Region Emergency Management Office, REMO, released an emergency planning workbook developed by and for disabled people based on the PCEP workbook. This isn't the only work going on internationally. There's also something called the Gaibandha model in Bangladesh. And also New Zealand researcher Dr. Leslie Gray tells us there's a great big gap where big-bodied people are systematically still being left out of emergency planning. In 2023, the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, led a global survey on people with disabilities and disasters, finding that 84% of disabled people did not have a personal disaster preparedness plan. Worryingly, this figure was somehow worse than a similar study conducted 10 years earlier. Given that disabled people and their carers have less time, resources, and skills to participate in DIDRR initiatives, we may need to provide additional support to help people get involved. But once we do connect, disabled people's lived experience from adapting to circumstances where their needs aren't being met on a daily basis may be directly relevant to emergency planning scenarios. And the bit that I'm really interested in, if someone out there does take the time to fill in their PSEP workbook or whatever and comes up with great ideas, how do we learn from each other? That's the nut I hope to crack, the knowledge sharing piece. This photo here is from the New Zealand Disability Employers Network Disability Inclusive Pathways Conference in 2021. There's a lot of talented people out there with great ideas, and as Phil Turner, the chief executive of NZDEN here will tell you, putting the effort into accessible solutions is a good investment, not a waste of resources. In my final slide here, let's wrap it up by reflecting disability inclusion and disaster risk reduction is a legal issue. It's the law and it's about human rights. But also economically, this just makes good sense. Putting time and resources into accessibility makes all our systems better for everyone. And finally, there's a moral factor. It's simply the right thing to do. Thanks, everyone. I'll follow up at the end of this year with a best practice guide for knowledge sharing of accessible DIDRR solutions. Maybe between now and then I'll come up with a snazzier title for it. But thanks for watching. Cheers.